can. Lon, take it
Okay.
away.
And I don't really have any slides, so I'm just going to talk and please ask questions if you want to post them in the chat, or I guess they can't post in the chat.
They can't. They can
They can
pass
just
them.
tell, they can just ask a question.
Yeah, they can just stand up and ask. And actually, we'll
Great.
keep this chair here for anybody that's talking to you.
Okay. All right. Perfect. Um, thanks. I did work with Martin for a while, and he's probably not told you like how great our newspaper was, but we had the absolute privilege of working for a newspaper when it was really, I think, at its peak. And so we had people at the Virginian-Pilot as writers, photographers, and graphic designers who would routinely win national awards in, photojournalism contest, feature writing contest, news coverage, design, and a lot of people who could have gone on to bigger and quote better newspapers in major cities, but chose to stay there because um, at a big paper, we might not have been able to cover exactly what we wanted, and there we could, really have the freedom and the creativity to go and pursue stories that we thought were worth pursuing. So, it was a real privilege, and I don't know what your career aspirations are. It's kind of like at the time that I left journalism, if you were at the stage of career that I was, you really didn't have much choice. You kind of had to go and find something else. But since then, it's kind of been like, the big bang of planets, I think. And I do actually think there are a lot of opportunities out there for people to cover the news. It's just that everything is really fractured now. So you have to probably be and more assertive and creative to go find that thing that lets you do what you really want to do. But I know there's probably a lot of people saying, "Oh, you don't want to go into that." But I do think there are a lot of opportunities out there for people who really want to do it. So anyway, with that sort of backdrop, Martin and I did have this one infamous story where we got to go interview a guy named Jimmy Dean, and there are still like frozen sausage biscuit patties out there that you can buy in the grocery store that have Jimmy Dean's name on them. And this is kind of humorous, but his nickname was Jimmy Dean, the Sausage King. And he was trying to get the Virginia legislature to approve this really goofy song, sappy song that he had written as the state song of Virginia. And so Martin and I saw this as an excuse to go spend some time with the Sausage King and interview him at his house. And the story that I will always remember is like Jimmy Dean he was very braggy. And when we first got there, he said, "Well, I don't usually like journalists because, my daddy told me that the worst thing a journalist could do to you is quote you accurately." And I was like, "Oh, that's great." So I had my recorder running, and what I did was kind of quote Jimmy accurately, and he came across as a big, doofus. But at the end of the interview, Martin had been having problems with his car. I think there was something major that was about to explode or catch on fire or something. And
That was just a little rattle.
yeah. So Martin's car was idling in the driveway as we were all exchanging our last words, and Jimmy Dean shouted to him, "Martin, go on and get out of here before your car blows up." And that's like my memorable thing from the assignment was Martin's, really questionable. I think it was a Jeep.
It was a Jeep. I don't recommend them.
Yeah. So anyway, with that being said, it was around that time that I guess the story that became the book that's behind me here, The Fever. Actually started at a Civic League meeting that I was not covering. I was going as a resident. And I think the lesson here is to be involved in your community and keep your eyes open at all times. And so there had been a big hurricane in the Norfolk area, and that resulted in a lot of low-lying land being flooded for a long period of time, which resulted in an explosion in the rat population. And I lived in a neighborhood beside water, and I had already done battle with squirrels getting into my house, and I didn't want to deal with rats. And so I thought they were going to have somebody from the city health department at the Civic League meeting. And I thought I better go to this and find out what the situation is because I don't want to have rats on my property. And so I went, and there was this woman with the city health department, and she was the person in the health department, her little unit was supposed to get rid of, you know, animals that transmitted disease. And it was called the Department of Vector Control. At the time, I didn't even know what a vector was, but a vector is some kind of animal that carries a virus from one thing to another. So it could carry a virus from monkeys to people, from mosquitoes to horses to people, from people to people. It's just a vector is a living transportation device. And so this woman was like, she kind of looked like your grandmother. She was very soft-spoken, and she had on a floral dress. And she really looked like somebody who had probably baked cookies for her grandchildren before coming to the meeting. But she was really, really on fire about rats. And the neighborhood was pretty like a pretty liberal neighborhood. And as she stood there and detailed, this very grandmotherly looking woman detailed multiple ways that you could go about killing and executing rats. I think some of the neighbors, it was like I said, like a lot of writers and artists and university faculty and generally like pretty liberal voters. And somebody raised their hand and said, is there a humane way that we can get rid of rats? And this woman goes, well, there are some traps. They're live traps and they're called Have a Heart. You can have a heart now, but you've got to kill them sometime. And I was like, oh my gosh, the rat lady is just really angry about, vermin. And so I was like, naturally, I was like, I think I want to do a story on the rat lady. And so I went out and I interviewed her, and we went around the city and we looked at these properties where they had like, people had piled up wood and stuff, and rats were like living underneath of them and all this. And it was vaguely interesting, but there was really no story there. And so at the end of this, and she had kind of gone into management. So she was no longer really, she was just kind of demonstrating for me, but she really wasn't directly involved in that work, which I kind of like saw a flag on that. Like I don't want to pretend that the rat lady is involved in actively getting rid of rats if she's really sitting in an office all day. And so at the very end, I said, well, I said, it's really been interesting. Thanks for all the time. I said, I just have one more question. Why are you so obsessed with getting rid of rats and mosquitoes? And she said, well, I'm sure you've heard of the 1855 yellow fever epidemic. And like everybody in Norfolk, I had, but I only knew a tiny, tiny bit about it. And so I just kind of bluffed and I said, "Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, that's the reason. I get it." And and then I went back to the office and I started looking up the 1855 yellow fever epidemic. And I couldn't believe what I found. Um, one of the first things I found was the writings of a minister who had just moved to Norfolk 4 years earlier, and found himself there in the summer of 1855 as all these strange things started happening. And he and his wife decided, as the first cases started being reported, that they had a conversation and they decided that his job as a minister was to be with his parishioners. And so, as dangerous as things got, they would stay behind. They would stay there and help the people in the church and in the town. Much like a doctor, he saw that as like his duty, even if his life were put at risk. And so I found he ended up writing, he would keep a diary and then he would compose these journal entries and send them to the secretary of the Virginia Historical Society. And so I ended up finding all these journal entries, and they were things that a narrative journalist like myself really, when it's 150 or 180 years ago, you can't go back and interview people. Whatever has been recorded at the time, that's what you have to work with. And so when this guy, Reverend Armstrong, wrote things like, um, I'm going to take you into a series of houses with me today. And he would talk about who he met with, and he would talk about meeting the dog at the front door and like the moaning and the wailing. And I would, I read this whole thing in the course of, and it was about 70 pages, single spaced, just type. And I read it in a couple of days. I mean, it's kind of like the equivalent of reading like a 250 page book. And all along the way, I just kept thinking, I can't believe this happened here. I can't believe this happened in this town. And really, it's barely been covered. And so I went to my editor and I said, I wrote a note on the thing. I was like, you have to read this. And she came back a couple days later and she said, I think this is the story we've been looking for. And I was like, yeah, I agree. So with that, Martin, is there any particular place you want me to go? You want me to go into, I mean, the natural place is to go into the fact gathering.
I think so. Yeah, I think that'd be really informative.
Okay.
Uh, and just what the process looks like. Initially, you did it long form in installments in a serial format for the newspaper. So it was a series. How many times did it publish?
It, wa-
Yeah, like
it was it was obnoxious even then. It was a 14-part series that ran on the front page every day.
but
And
they also did reprints. I think I
they
still have
did
an old reprint.
they did reprints too. Yeah. And there were people in the newsroom who were like, too long, nobody's gonna read it.
Hmm.
But I'll get back to that. So I think you've gone over this a little bit, Martin said. So when you have a great story like that, then you have to think about the best book that you've ever read and what qualities do you need for your story to make it as good as that best book you've ever read. And so if you think about that, I mean, you want to have people talking to each other, right? You don't want them to preferably talk to you. So I wanted dialogue. Um, I wanted to know, and I'm jumping into the whole book now, but I wanted to know a lot about what was it like to live there at that time, regardless of whether there was yellow fever or not. What was life in 1855 in coastal Virginia like? So, I looked up stuff about how many there's a whole thing called the city directory, and it sounds like just like a listing of names and addresses, but it's much more than that. It went into describing, you know, the land that the city sat on and how that land was was sloped so that every time it rained, the rain gently rolled down into the river. Um, what I learned about the river the quality of the water in the river is it wasn't just rain that ran down to the river. Of course, everything was like horse and buggy then. So horses pooped in the street. Um, when they had a city market and they had fresh fish there and somebody would buy a fish and they would clean the fish right then, they would just dump the fish entrails, on the spot. So every time it rained, all this literally crap washed downhill and into the river. So later in the book, when people jump into the river, to get off of a ship that has yellow fever, you think about that's what they were swimming in. I wanted to be able to say on any given day, August 5th, 1855, somebody's walking down the street. What's the weather like? Was it a hot day or not so hot of a day? Um, was it, did it rain later? Was there rain sitting in the street? And that sort of thing. And I got lucky with that. There's a place called the National Climatic Data Center in Asheville, North Carolina. And I called them up and I said, I'm looking for records for the weather from Norfolk and Portsmouth, Virginia in 1855. And lo and behold, the Surgeon General of the Army at that time had ordered a military base in Norfolk to to report the weather every day. And there was a record of what the temperature was 3 times a day. And in the notes column to the right of that, it would say, you know, zero point 0.4 inches rain, thunderstorms, and stuff like that. So I developed the ability to tell people like what the weather was like on a certain day. Um, I dug deep, deep, deep into research about mosquitoes and how mosquitoes spread disease. And you all may have heard this, but there's a scientist has nicknamed mosquitoes, quote, the most dangerous animal on Earth. Every year, mosquitoes kill way, way, way more people than people with guns kill, than sharks, lightning, dog bites, anything else. Mosquitoes, hundreds of times more people are killed by mosquitoes every year. And it's interesting that even in 2025, if you just go after this class and Google West Nile virus or dengue fever, or yellow fever, you'll find an outbreak of all these things that's happening somewhere in the world right now. You can find it on the World Health Organization website and the CDC website. So during writing the series for the newspaper, I'd set up all these Google alerts. And after the series was over, I thought about writing a book and I didn't. And I never got rid of the Google alerts. And down through the years, they just every day they would come up like West Nile virus outbreak in such and such place in Massachusetts, in Utah, dengue fever outbreak. And we had a dengue fever outbreak in Florida last year, which is carried by the same mosquito that carries yellow fever. I don't know. It's been a while now, but the Brazil Olympics were almost canceled because of Zika virus outbreaking in Brazil. That's also the same mosquito that carries yellow fever. So, as much as yellow fever went away in the United States, it never has gone away in the world. And the mosquito that carries it is still a threat to, most people every year. Um, I dug deeper and deeper. I found out that a nurse who was the first nurse volunteer in Norfolk in 1855, her name was Annie Andrews. Um, she was profiled 2 years after that in Harper's Magazine alongside Florence Nightingale, one of the most well-known, nurse heroes of the past 200 years. And this nurse, Annie Andrews, who came from a wealthy family, and she was one of the first medical people to report there to help out from an outside state was upheld alongside Florence Nightingale. So even though the story had been forgotten down through the years and really never became a national story, it kind of tells you how much it was focused on at the time by media, that this unheard of woman would be held up alongside, sort of an international heroine. So that also was a clue to me that like this is a big story you're on to. You really need to stick with this, if nothing else, like if not for riches, really for just the sake of history, that this will be preserved and this story will finally fully be told. So maybe that's a place to pause, Martin. And does anybody have any questions in the class? Okay.
Not at the time.
Okay, I can keep going.
Yeah.
Martin, any particular area you want me to take this to?
Um, I think, how does this book set you up for the rest of your career trajectory? Or how does it fit in to everything that you've done? Or does it fit in?
Um,
You
I, I hope
talked
it
about the
does.
start.
No,
Do
I hope it does.
you consider yourself a science writer?
Not really. I mean, it's what any journalist does, I think. Whatever the story is that you want to tell, you go and try to become as much of an expert on that as you can. I do now, I guess there's no gatekeeping for this term, but um, it's kind of hard for me to think of, but I do consider myself to be a historian now, because not only did I learn about this part of history, but I learned about, all of the 1850s. And there are just, God, like what a crazy, what a crazy time the 1850s were. And I've heard a historian, shoot, what is her name? She does a Substack every day. I've heard her say that the one time in history that can be compared to now are the 1850s,
Hmm.
which led up to the Civil War, right? And we don't know where this is leading right now, but there was a similar amount of chaos then as there is now. Um,
Interesting.
so I learned about Irish immigration because there were so many Irish in Norfolk in 1855. Like, why were they there? And we all think about Irish immigrants landing in places like Boston and New York and Philadelphia. But there were so many Irish that came to the United States between 1847 and throughout the 1850s. They couldn't all go to one city. They went wherever there were really manual labor jobs. And in Portsmouth, it was a big shipbuilding community, and they knew this. And so they were like, we can go to Portsmouth and get jobs working on ships. And so that's why there were a ton of Irish, and that's why I ended up learning about, Irish history. Um, Much like now, I learned that the sudden influx of those particular immigrants led to a political backlash with an anti-immigrant party called the American Party. And these people absolutely hated the Irish Catholics specifically, and formed a political party around keeping them out and
Hmm.
not allowing them to become citizens. And they started off as a secret society. And when anybody asked you, are you a member of the American Party? They would respond, I know nothing. And so they got nicknamed the Know Nothing Party. In the Virginia election of 1855, it was the Know Nothing Party against the Democrats. And the Know Nothing candidate just went home. He thought he had it in the bag and went home and sat on his porch. And the Democratic candidate went out and really campaigned hard. But ironically or sadly, it was basically a competition among them about which party would be the least kind to black people. The whole campaign was like, who is going to be the toughest on black people in our country?
Hmm.
And the Democrats at that time convinced everybody that it was them, and the Know Nothings lost in Virginia. And much like now, Virginia is one of those states that has its election in off years. And so that was kind of a precursor to what would happen in 1856. But anyway, so I learned about all this stuff that I didn't really, want to be an expert in, but I kind of had to become an expert in everything about 1850s life in America because, you know, I wanted to put people in the proper context.
So obviously a lot of reading, a lot of research, time in libraries, but who were your human sources for, maybe guides or historians maybe, or science authorities? Who do you go to fill those knowledge gaps?
Good question. Um, so I started finding a few things online, and I went to the history room of the local public library, like a room that nobody really ever walks through. There are a couple people in there just because they're super dedicated and to preserve history. And I said, I found these writings of the Reverend George Armstrong. Well, I called him on the phone, and I said, "Do you have other stuff about the 1855 epidemic?" And the historian said, "Yes, we have. In fact, the person who's doing the archiving of that is here right now. Would you like to talk to her?" And so I said, "Yeah, sure." And so I said, "Have you ever read anything by a guy named William Forrest?" And she just like this really meek woman, she goes, "Well, yes, that's on my website." And I said, "Okay, have you ever found anything about medicine in the 1850s?" And she said, "Well, yes, that's on my website." And every question I asked, she's like, "That's on my website." And I was like, "Well, I've got to see this website." So as it turns out, about a year before I got onto the story, the library history room put this volunteer onto the case of finding all the firsthand sources that she could find and transcribing it. And that became an amazing source of information for me. But also meeting her, she was so dedicated that she found out that people were buried in local cemeteries and that down through the years, as the lawnmowers go through the cemetery and they throw grass at the tombstones, it covers up grave markers that, to the extent that like there'll be 6 inches of dirt and muck and stuff on top of, a grave marker. And so this woman, Donna Bloomink, when it rained, she would get in her minivan and go out to the cemeteries, and she had gotten all the plot books that would say, and what it would say is something like Smith-Rodden location, aisle E, row 7, marker F. And she would go out to this spot and there'd be nothing there. And so she had a shovel, a broken off shovel handle, and she got a metal spike like this long, and she duct taped it to the shovel handle. And she would go out to that spot and jab this thing down into the ground, into the wet ground. And when it hit something solid, then she would get a real shovel out and she would dig down there and she would uncover the grave marker. And so this woman kind of literally found buried history. She uncovered more than 100 grave markers that had disappeared in the past 150 years, took photographs of them, documented the location and who that was, and put them on her website. Very, very, very few people are ever going to look at this website, but You can imagine that you find out somebody with your same last name died of yellow fever in 1855, and then her work becomes a super valuable resource to connect you to your family history. And so it's really like one thing at a time, but that was a human source that I uncovered. Another one was a guy right in my College of Science at Virginia Tech, and he was a statistician, or he is a statistician, and he actually became our dean for a while. And right as COVID was coming out and emerging, he had written a story. He had written this totally wonky academic book that nobody was ever going to read. And it was something about using statistics to predict the next global pandemic. And this was to come out in January of 2020. And just as it was being like proofread for the very last time, COVID cases started emerging. And the publishers asked this guy and his co-author, hey, maybe you should write a new foreword to the book that connects this to COVID. And so he did, and the book comes out in like March of 2020 or April or something. And then this statistician, so I went up to him and I was like, Ron, we should really promote this. We need to put out a press release. And he's like, you know what I wish would happen? I really wish that this book would just go away. And it's like, I don't really want to talk about it. I certainly don't want to be the one to like connect it to COVID for profit. And I was like, Ron, you can help people understand, what is happening and what may be about to happen and put some science behind it. And so we worked together on that at my job. And then it turned out that his epilogue was entirely about how Walter Reed discovered that mosquitoes carried yellow fever and the scientific tests that they did to prove that it was mosquitoes. And so Ron and I began talking about that, and he became another modern day human source for the book. So that's just a couple of examples. Uh,
That's a great story.
what I would say was a really, really difficult thing about the book, and this is the result of, being history and nobody still alive that you can interview. But um, we always want to have dialogue in a book. I think people down through the years have told me, when I read your writing, it's like I'm there. And, I'd like to tell all of you that that is not a magical writing thing. It's something that you can do that any person who wants to do can achieve. And you achieve that through having dialogue in your work. And you can have dialogue in a 400 word piece as well as you can have it in a 200,000 word piece. Um, so I missed that in the book. All the stuff I read, whenever I saw people talking to each other, and it was really, really rare, but I would snip that out and make a note of that to use that because I didn't have much dialogue to choose from. Um, so what do I wish the book could have had in it? I wish it could have had more dialogue of people talking to each other. I wish it could have had the Black perspective because in 1855, um, most Black people were not even, if you were an enslaved person, you were not allowed to learn to read and write. And so, you know, the people who write down history are the people who get to be like the heroes of history. And I really regret that I don't have any insight really that summer in firsthand insight into how the enslaved blacks and the freed blacks in Norfolk and Portsmouth got through that epidemic. It's very much a white person book, and I ask around I contacted the Library of Virginia. I looked in diaries. I couldn't find much of anything. So,
So that dialogue and giving people a voice is something I often talk about when I'm uh, uh, really talking through the narrative. Actually, it's one of the things I really like about television journalism is it puts people's voices up front and center.
mhm.
Um, where do you find those voices? How do you find a voice that is, how do you find a dialogue and two people talking to each other if it happened 1.5 centuries earlier from when you're like putting those in through letters or transcripts?
Well, and there was yeah, and there were some things where Reverend Armstrong or somebody else would describe something like this. Um, the the health officer came out to the ship and asked the captain, "Do you have any sick people on board?" And the captain assured him that no, they did not have any sick crew on board, nor did they transport anybody up. So I would go in there and I put a note in the book and I explained how I created dialogue out of that. And I would have that scene. That scene would often be described in two different authors' papers. So I felt really confident that it happened that way. So for the book, I would take that dialogue and I would turn that into the health officer said, "Do you have any sick crew on board?" "No," the captain replied. Everyone on board is healthy." So I would take what was given to me as factual reporting and rewrite that into dialogue. But I would be very careful to use the exact same words that were written, but they were just written as narrative, not as dialogue.
Mhm.
If I didn't have what I thought were the exact words, then I didn't I didn't use it.
Well,
I,
so the vetting and the verification of the of that work had to be just a mammoth task.
well, and so the book is independently published, and a big reason for that is because I had an agent who wanted me to fictionalize it, and
Mm.
I didn't want to. Um, and I probably could have been a more profitable endeavor for me. But I thought a powerful thing about the book was I always wanted people to be able to say, "I can't believe everything in here really happened." And so I was pretty hard on myself and hard on the book to make sure that I could say that at the end. Now, ignoring like if it's 150 years ago, how do you do that is much easier. And what I would advise you all to do when you go out to report a story is to get there early and stand around and don't tell anybody, "I'm a journalist, I'm doing this." I just stand there and kind of off to the side and look and observe and write down what those sounds that you're hearing are. And if you can snag some dialogue out of two people talking back and forth to each other, it does so much of the work in making you look like a great writer. And we would experiment like things like this. I mean, a friend of mine at the Roanoke Times covered it was like the 15th annual, town road, 5K road race, right? So like the first year, it's a cool story, but the 15th year, it's not. And he decided to go out and cover this 5K without talking to anybody. That's a pretty cool story, right? I mean, you don't want to use it as an excuse for your own shyness of walking up to people and asking them stuff. But if you can go out and do a story with just the sights and sounds that are naturally occurring, I mean, TV has like a term for this, nat sound. If you can go out and you can get some nat sound, and then you can incorporate that with your interviews and your observations, you're ahead of like 75% of other journalists in bringing life to the story automatically.
Yeah, we had an exercise about that on that just about a week or so ago. I want to stop asking questions and you guys can jump in. I could easily fill up the air with all sorts of questions, but I'm not the important person in the room.
I suppose I could ask a question.
Yes, come on up, sit.
Yep. Try to take a long little walk around.
Yeah, it's you putting yourself in the hot seat.
Um, because you obviously talked about you had so many different sources that you had to reach out to, and you had to like keep digging and digging and digging. Um, was there ever a time that you found a dead end, and what did you do when you reached that point?
What a great question. Well, I already talked about the one with like the Black community.
Mhm.
Um, so there's something in the book that that I did not I don't have a solution to, and it's frustrating, but so that it'll kind of give you some insight. And I hope that like one of you someday will read the book, but maybe you'll forget this part. Pretty far deep in the book, the minister's family gets sick. And this is just a detail that I don't have that drives me crazy. Um, his wife becomes violently ill with yellow fever, and it's clear that she's not going to make it. And she summons their two daughters back to her bedroom on a night, and it's like there is a nor'easter that has just come in, so the temperature has dropped 20 degrees, wind is howling. The minister, it's only September, but the minister has like engaged the fireplaces in the room, so it's like it's kind of a great movie scene, you know? And she calls the children in, and I know what she tells them. And she talks about, she's a very religious person. She talks about Jesus and how she's at peace and all that. And she wants them to be at peace. And the description says that she gave them a couple of personal mementos. And I mean, any if this ever happens to you, like on a story and people are still alive, I mean, the obvious question is, what did she give them? And there's no other source other than what the minister wrote down, and he's deceased, and everybody is. And so, you know, it's like there were only five people in the house, so there's a very, very limited number of people who could have known what that was. But to not exactly answer your question about what did I do, but that's an example of a time when I did hit a dead end and I didn't have any way around it.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Okay, so only 2 minutes left in the class. However, if you have time and if the students have time, there's nobody else in this room after this class. So if you have more questions or want to know a little bit more or hang out, room full of intro to journalism, intro to news writing students here. We went through all different story forms over the last maybe week and a half. Inverted pyramid, all the kind of, highly formatted and sometimes god awful structures that are out there. What's a through line, to use kind of a historical term? What is something that you've always really leaned on in your career, whether you're doing news writing or you're stuck doing the Saturday reporter on the weekend, like we used to do at the Pilot, or you're doing long form, or you're in Stratcom. What's one thing that has been consistent?
Well, finding the story, like finding a story if you can. And if you can't, just being a good writer and thinking about, you hear this, and I didn't understand this for half of my life, but that verbs are what make your writing sound strong and confident.
Hmm.
And so really, really think about strong verbs in every sentence. And I would urge all of you, I've had the glorious writing job at the newspaper where I was on the front page, and I've written utter, BS press releases that I hope to never see my name on again. But if you can become a really strong writer and see strong writing in other people's writing, so in other words, have some ability to make other people's writing better, I've had a good paying job my whole life. I mean, and I was an English major. I was like what my parents told me not to be, you know, because you will never get a job. But there are so many people on our planet who cannot write well, that I believe you're always going to be able to pay the bills if you can learn to write well. And so that's what I mean. You can do PR, you can do journalism, you can do, business technical writing, but if you're a good writer, I think there's a market out there for that.
And being flexible and kind of an itinerant writing professional, moving from one thing to another as you have. And many people, haven't. They've chosen not to. They really like the pipeline, but that pipeline's not around anymore.
Right. You got to make your own pipeline.
Yeah, or pipelines.
Right.
Okay. Other questions? Okay.
Thanks everybody for being good listeners. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, this was great. I'm going to order a couple of, I want one book for myself, but I also want to order one for our library. I'm not sure we have it.
That'd be wonderful. I'd appreciate it.
So I'll work on that. Um, your website, you can order off the website.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Excellent.
Yep.
Okay.
And all the usual places, Amazon, Barnes and Noble.
Okay.
Yep.
Do you have an ebook? I mean, I'm sorry, do you have a audiobook?
No, I've been asked for one, but I haven't done that. And my publisher, that's one thing they don't by habit provide. So,
Uh,
yeah.
no kidding. Well,
I know.
yeah,
I actually, as much as I'm a writer, I love audiobooks. I love to walk around listening to a book.
oh,
So,
I do too.
get it.
I have an hour commute. I live in Indy and I work in Muncie.
Mhm.
So there's audiobooks are a big part of my life.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
and Mike Hixenbaugh's audiobook is pretty damn good, I have to admit. But
Just,
I also have his hard copy.
yeah, right, right. I just do. Okay.
All right, I'll let you go. Thank you so much for this.
Absolutely. Thank you, Martin. Find me anytime.
All right, bye-bye.